Funerals are supposed to be quiet, emotional, and predictable, but the funeral of broke every expectation, and what unfolded that day left even leaders like completely silent. Hundreds of people stood outside a small church in County Galway, forming long lines that stretched far beyond the entrance, waiting patiently for hours. And the strange part wasn't just the crowd, it was the feeling that something about this farewell was different from the very beginning. Just days earlier, news had spread quietly that Dolores Keane had passed away peacefully at her home at the age of 72. There was no chaos in the announcement, just a deep, collective realization that a voice many people had grown up with was suddenly gone. But what followed her passing raised more questions than answers. Because people didn't just mourn her loss, they showed up in numbers that no one had expected. Outside, people queued for hours before the funeral mass even began. Some stood silently, others spoke softly, but everyone shared the same quiet anticipation. Why would hundreds of people wait this long for a funeral? And what exactly were they expecting to witness inside that church? As the doors finally opened, the crowd slowly moved forward, filling every seat, every aisle, every available space. And even before the service properly began, there was already a sense that this moment carried more meaning than a typical farewell. Among those present were not only family members and close friends, but also figures of national importance, including. And when respected leaders like Michael D. Higgins quietly took their place among the crowd, it became clear this was not just a personal loss. Even the Taoiseach was represented through his aide, Commandant Joseph Glennon, adding another layer of significance to the gathering. But despite the presence of power and recognition, the atmosphere remained deeply personal and grounded. At the start of the service, something simple yet meaningful took place. Several objects were carried forward and placed carefully at the altar. At first they appeared ordinary, almost routine, like part of a traditional ceremony. But as people looked closer, each object began to reveal a deeper story. There was one of her albums, representing years of music shared with audiences across Ireland and beyond. A Lifetime Achievement Award, symbolizing recognition that stretched far beyond her hometown. A concertina reflecting her deep connection to traditional Irish music and the roots she never left behind. And a simple teacup, quietly representing the small, personal moments she shared with family. Each object stood silently, yet together they told a story that words alone could not fully explain. Because they represented not just success, but a life balanced between public recognition and private memories. And just as people began to absorb these details, the atmosphere inside the church shifted again. Because instead of silence continuing, something unexpected began to take its place. Music. Musicians from across Ireland had gathered, including and not only to attend but to contribute through live performance. And as the first notes filled the space, it became clear that this farewell would not follow the usual pattern. The music was not loud or overwhelming, but calm, steady, and deeply familiar to those listening. It didn't interrupt the silence, it blended into it, creating something more meaningful. People who had come expecting quiet mourning found themselves experiencing something different. Because this was not just grief being expressed, it was memory being shared. And then, in the middle of it all, came a moment that shifted everything once again. A moment that did not rely on music, but on words. People came expecting a goodbye, but what they witnessed instead changed the meaning of that moment completely. The homily was delivered by a close friend of the Keane family. And from the very beginning, his words carried a quiet weight that filled the room without needing emphasis. He spoke about Ireland as a small island known across the world for its culture, its traditions, and its achievements. And he made it clear that Dolores Keane had been part of what made that recognition possible. He described her as someone who captured hearts, not through noise or attention, but through something deeper and more lasting. A voice that connected people without needing explanation. He spoke about how difficult it was to fully understand what she had achieved over the years, and how her presence had stood out, even among many. Then he shared something that stayed with everyone listening. That she stood among the crowd, but never above it. He described her humility, explaining that even through universal fame, she never changed as a person. And that idea seemed to resonate deeply with everyone sitting there in silence. Because in that moment, people weren't just remembering a singer. They were remembering someone who remained grounded, no matter how far her influence reached. In the days leading up to the funeral, she had been waked at Carrog Cottage, her family home. A place that held the very beginning of her journey. And suddenly, that detail became more important than anyone had realized at first. Because the place where her story began had also become part of how it ended. That cottage was not just a house, it was where traditions were passed down, where music was learned, where everything quietly started. And now it had become part of her final farewell. As the service continued, the music, the words, and the silence blended into something shared by everyone present. It didn't feel like a performance, it felt like understanding. Outside, even more people continued to gather, unable to fit inside the church but still wanting to be part of the moment. And that raised one final question that lingered quietly in the background. What had truly brought all of these people here? It wasn't just recognition. It wasn't just respect. It was something deeper, something that connected people beyond explanation. Something that could not be measured in awards or achievements. As the service came to an end, the focus slowly shifted toward the final journey. And the movement of the crowd began again, this time slower, more reflective. Dolores Keane was carried toward where she would be laid to rest. And for a moment, everything felt quieter than before. But this silence felt different. It wasn't empty, it was full of meaning. People stood still, watching, reflecting, holding onto something they could not easily describe. And maybe that was the most powerful part of the entire day. Because nothing dramatic had happened. No sudden event, no shocking reveal. And yet no one who was there would ever forget it. Because what they experienced was not something that could be easily explained. This funeral did not change anything on the surface. But it changed how people understood a life, a legacy, and a farewell. And that is what made it different. Not what was said, but what was felt. Because in the end, this was not just the funeral of Dolores Keane. It was the moment her absence made her presence stronger than ever. And perhaps that is why hundreds of people waited for hours without complaint. Not to witness an ending, but to experience something that would stay with them long after they left. Because some farewells are not about saying goodbye. They are about understanding what can never truly be lost. And that is what made this day impossible to forget. But even after everything that happened inside the church, one thought continued to linger in the minds of those who attended. Was this really the end of her story, or just the beginning of how she would be remembered? Because long after the crowd had dispersed and the Arabic meme, Arabic rot, Arabic Khalif, Arabic scene, Arabic meme had come to a close, her voice, her influence, and her presence remained. Not in one place, but in the memories of everyone who had gathered there. And maybe that is why this funeral felt different from the very beginning. Because it was never just about loss, it was about legacy. And that legacy refused to fade.